Okay, so it's good to see everyone. A reminder that today is our last class of the academic year. We'll pick up again after Labor Day, which I guess the second Sunday in September. And then we'll have a pretty rocky schedule in in the fall because, well, not necessarily because of the holidays. The holidays are during the week, so we won't have to miss because of that. But there's a wedding I have to do on Sunday, October 5th. My daughter is getting married on November 2nd, and then I'm going to Israel in December. So
Hello.
anyway, yes. So well, anyway, there's plenty of time for that. Let me share my screen, and here we are. And just move you out of the way, and let me just close my door. Okay, so Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we left off last time here on this page of the PDF 113 of the Koran PDF, which is, does it say what page we're on in the regular Talmud? Yes, 20a in Bava Badra. Okay. So we're in the midst of a discussion or a tangent discussion about right. So the bigger discussion is how far you have to. Can you impose a restriction on an owner of a piece of land that involves not planting a tree or digging a pit or a laundry pit or something like that within a certain distance of a neighbor's property? Okay, and in the midst of that lengthy discussion, we get to what might impact the size of a window in a house that would then make the window so small that that ritual impurity would not be able to be transported from one room to another. Okay? So this bizarre concept of, well, ritual impurity is a pretty unusual concept, and the only thing we know about it in Jewish law today really is regarding married women once a month. But there's a whole slew of other circumstances in which one can become impure, especially around being in the presence of a corpse. And that is only tangential today because there is no way, when the temple is not standing in Jerusalem, there's no way to become purified from contact with a corpse. And so the laws that we read about it in the Mishnah are quite extensive, but for us, they're really hypothetical because there's nothing we can do about it to become purified. So in a way, we're all, every single person is ritually impure because we've been in contact, knowingly or unknowingly, with the dead at least once in our life. So anyway, the Braita teaches, or grass that grew on its own also reduces the dimensions of the window. The Gemara asks, but since the grass damages the wall, the owner will remove it. Therefore, it should not serve as a barrier to impurity. Rabbah says this is referring to a wall of a ruin whose structural integrity is insignificant, and therefore the owner will not trouble himself to remove the grass. Rav Papa says the Braita may even be referring to a wall in a settled house, and it's referring to a case where the grass comes from 3 handbreadths beyond the window. In other words, the grass does not grow on the window, but takes root some distance away, and from there it reaches the window. The homeowner is not particular about this grass and will not uproot it. The Gemara further asks, why do scraps of fabric reduce the dimensions of the window? After all, they are fit for patching a tear in a garment. The Gemara answers, this is referring to thick straps, which are unsuitable for patching. The Gemara challenges, nevertheless, they are fit for a bloodletter to wipe up the blood at the point of incision. The Gemara answers, it's referring to sackcloth, which scratches the skin and would not be used for that purpose. The Gemara asks, I'm not spending that much time on this to kind of get to the details here, because it's just, it's really, I'm just waiting for this discussion to be over to get back to neighbors and their properties. The Gemara asks, if it's referring to sackcloth, why does the Baraita state that it's not 3 by 3 finger breadths? It should have said that it's not 4 by 4 hand breadths. Rough woven material of the kind used for sacks rather than clothes is susceptible to impurity only if its area measures at least 4 by 4 hand breadths. The Gemara answers, it's not actual sackcloth, rather it's like sackcloth, that is, it is stiff and will therefore not be used by a bloodletter, but is woven like regular clothing. The Gemara teaches, and a limb or flesh dangling from an animal or a beast reduces the dimensions of a window. The Gemara asks, according to the opinion of Shmuel, why should this be so? After all, the animal can arise and escape, and therefore it should not be considered as part of the window. The Gemara answers, this is referring to an animal that is tied in place. The Gemara challenges, but the owner of the animal will take it and slaughter it. The Gemara answers, it's referring to an animal that is non-kosher and will not be slaughtered. The Gemara challenges, even so he will take it and sell it to a Gentile. The Gemara responds, it's referring to a lean animal which no one will buy. The Gemara continues, even if the animal does not move, there is a use for the part that is dangling, since he can cut it off and throw it to the dogs. The Gemara answers, since there is suffering to an animal, if he cuts it off, he will not do that. The Baraita further teaches, and a bird resting in the window reduces its dimensions. The Gemara challenges, but it will fly away, and therefore it should not be considered as part of the window. The Gemara answers, this is referring to a bird that is tied in place. The Gemara further challenges, but the owner will take it and slaughter it. The Gemara answers, this is referring to a non-kosher bird, which he will not slaughter. The Gemara continues, even if it's non-kosher, he will take it and sell it to a Gentile. The Gemara responds, it's referring to a kelanita, a type of bird that is so bony that no one would purchase it to consume it. And let's just see, that's in background, kelanita. Various explanations have been offered for the origin of this term. It's possibly Greek for swallow, yet swallows do not fit the description given here. Some commentaries suggest that this refers to a seabird, for example, the petrel, which is bony and whose meat is tough and virtually inedible. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I mean, a lot of this seems far-fetched,
Yes.
but it almost sounds like what the Gemara is trying to do is find a way to reduce the transmission of
Yes.
impurity so it becomes just less of a problem.
Yes, I think so. I think the rabbis like to try to make Jewish law as easy as possible for people to follow, and they understand that the laws of ritual purity are pretty complicated. So they want to make it. Want to try to make it as easy to observe, without also, because if it's not easy, then they risk a lot of people in the community being impure unintentionally, right? So you want to try to make sure that people are as best as possible in a state of ritual purity. All right, the Gemara asks, but even so, he can give it to a child to play with, so why does it reduce the dimensions of the window? The Gemara answers it's referring to a bird that scratches. The Gemara challenges, but a kelanita does not scratch. The Gemara answers, the Baraita is referring to a type of bird that is like a kelanita in that it is bony, but it is inclined to scratch people. The Baraita further states, and a Gentile sitting in the window reduces its dimensions. The Gemara asks, but the Gentile will arise and leave, so why does he reduce the dimensions of the window? The Gemara answers, this is referring to someone who is tied in place. The Gemara continues, another person will come and release him. The Gemara answers, this is referring to a leper whom people are afraid to touch. The Gemara challenges, another leper will come and release him. Rather, this is referring to a prisoner of the monarchy. Since he is confined as punishment, others are afraid to release him. The Baraita teaches, and a child born after 8 months of pregnancy who is placed in the window reduces its dimensions. The Gemara challenges, perhaps his mother will come and remove him from there. The Gemara answers, this is referring to Shabbat, when it's prohibited to move this child, as it's taught in a Baraita, a child born after 8 months is like a stone with regard to the halachot of muktzah, and therefore it's prohibited to move him. But his mother may bend over the child and nurse him due to the danger that failure to nurse will cause her to fall ill. So this sounds bizarre, but okay, there are items. Muktzah refers to items that are not allowed to be touched, let alone moved, on Shabbat, because you'll be violating the laws of Shabbat by doing so. So bizarrely, a child born premature is considered in the category of something not to be touched, because the likelihood is that premature birth, that child will die. And so therefore it's not viable. And so something that is in the category of not viable is then in the category of muktzah. So that's the best way I can explain it. It still sounds cruel, and then the way the mother is allowed to nurse this baby by bending over and not holding the baby picking up the baby and holding it to her chest also sounds bizarre. So I'm not sure if people actually followed these laws or not, but then again, if people had midwives, and midwives were the ones who took care of things and might have prepared mothers and parents for the inevitability that a premature birth is not going to be viable. But that's about as much as I can say about that. The Baraita teaches, salt reduces the dimensions of a window. The Gemara challenges, it is fit for use and people will remove it from there. The Gemara answers, this is referring to bitter salt, which is not used as a seasoning. The Gemara challenges, nevertheless, it is fit for tanning hides. The Gemara responds, it's referring to salt that has thorns mixed with it, and therefore it will not be used for tanning. The Gemara challenges, even so, since this salt is damaging to the wall, he will remove it from there. The Gemara answers, this is referring to a case where it sits on a shard of earthenware, and consequently, it does not damage the wall. The Gemara states, if it is resting on earthenware, let the shard itself serve as a barrier against the spreading of the impurity. Why then is the salt mentioned? The Gemara answers, this is referring to a case where the shard does not have the sufficient measure for ritual impurity and is therefore considered insignificant. As we learned in a Mishnah, one who carries a shard of earthenware on Shabbat is liable only if it is equivalent in size to that which is used to place between one pillar and another when they are piled on the ground to strengthen the pillars. The Baraita teaches, an earthenware vessel reduces the dimensions of a window. The Gemara challenges, but it's fit for one to use, therefore it's likely to be removed from the window. The Gemara answers, this is referring to a case where the earthenware is dirty. The Gemara challenges, even so, it is fit for a bloodletter to collect the blood. It would not matter to him if the earthenware were dirty. The Gemara answers, it is referring to a case where it is perforated and therefore unfit for that use. the Baraita teaches. A Torah scroll reduces the dimensions of a window. The Gemara challenges, but it's fit for reading. Therefore, it might be removed. The Gemara answers. This is referring to a Torah scroll that's worn out and unfit for reading. The Gemara challenges, but one is required to place the Torah scroll in a repository for unusable sacred books, a geniza. Therefore, he will certainly remove it to be stored away. The Gemara answers, this is referring to one who determines that its repository will be there. In other words, it was placed in the window with the intent of storing it there in its worn-out state. Okay. So now a tangent to a tangent. With regard to the halacha of the Baraita referring to salt, the Gemara cites that which Rav says, one can construct a barrier to delineate a private domain on Shabbat, or to block the spreading of ritual impurity with anything except for salt and fat, as salt crumbles and fat melts in the heat. Okay, so a barrier to create a private domain. So let me just explain this. In Olney and in Kemp Mill, in other communities that have a significant Orthodox population around the world, there is something called an eruv. This is the kind of barrier that the rabbis are referring to here. We know from the laws of Shabbat that we're not allowed to carry on Shabbat. We're not allowed to carry outside of one kind of domain into another kind of domain. We can't carry from public to private, and we can't carry from private to public. Now, there is a way for the rabbis to allow for the enhancement of community, and that by creating a barrier around a public area to make it seem as if it's private, so that you can carry like a pot of food or something like that, so that you can go to your neighbors and share meals with your neighbors and things like that. So the way the eruv works nowadays in modern communities is that there are telephone poles, and usually the organization that wants to build the eruv is usually from the Orthodox synagogue in that community, and they ask permission from the owners of the telephone poles, the utilities, to be able to put a piece of wood on the telephone pole that symbolically shows that the telephone pole has been transformed into the boundary of the eruv. And so anybody who has walked on Georgia Avenue, on the shul side of Georgia Avenue, heading north, that is uphill from the synagogue, will pay attention to the telephone poles there and know that there's a piece of wood nailed to them, so that the telephone wire or the electric wire is then part of the eruv. And so the boundary of the eruv is our side of Georgia Avenue down to Emery Lane. And so our synagogue happens to be within the eruv, and the boundary is the Georgia Avenue, our side of Georgia Avenue, where the telephone poles are. And then it cuts over at Old Baltimore, just past the firehouse, and includes my neighborhood, and goes around that way. Anyway, if you just Google eruv Olney, you'll see a map of the eruv. And if you Google eruv Kemp Mill, you'll see the map of the eruv in Kemp Mill also. If you do eruv, Oceanside, New York, or any other Great Neck, New York, you'll see the maps of the eruv there. So
Is there any limit to the size of an eruv? I mean, you could make one the size of the United States, to be ridiculous.
no, you can't really. You can only do it because there is a law, and you're not allowed to travel more than a certain distance outside of a city on Shabbat. You can't walk a certain distance outside of a city. So no. Doing that. So the question though is, can Manhattan, the island of Manhattan, see, an island is a natural eruv because you have the ocean or a river on all sides. So an island, apparently, according to the rabbis, can be counted as private domain if there's a road on the island wide enough for 600,000 people to walk. And that is how many people were in the desert and how they walked in the desert for 40 years. So I learned this in rabbinical school, that there is such a road that crosses Manhattan. You know, when you cross over the GW Bridge from New Jersey, you're on 95 there, and you're on 95 until, it crosses Manhattan. The problem is it goes under an apartment building. So when the road it becomes a tunnel, it invalidates the road. So there isn't another road. In other words, like the West Side Highway is not like it has to be a road that crosses the island. So the FDR Drive and the West Side Highway, if they were interconnected and so that they were like you can travel on one and lead into the other, it doesn't exactly work that way. But if it did, then that would count. Anyway, so I'm sharing this with you because it sounds bizarre and a typical rabbinic style of deriving laws and interpretations about this. So that's why within Manhattan itself, there's an eruv for different, like the Upper West Side, I'm sure has an eruv. The Upper East Side, I'm sure has an eruv, that kind of thing. So no, you can't connect one city with another city so that you can walk across the United States within the eruv. That would not be allowed. Okay, but salt, if you're going to use, so what can you use? So in modern times, we have telephone wires that are on poles or electric lines that are on poles like that, and that's like a fence already. But if you didn't have those kinds of things, what else can you use? You can use anything to create a fence, but you can't use salt and fat because they disintegrate. Like it says here, salt crumbles and fat melts in the heat. And Shmuel says even salt can be used as a barrier. Rav Papa said, and they do not disagree, as this ruling of Shmuel is referring to sodomite salt, which is like stone and can be used as a barrier, and that ruling of Rav is referring to isterokanit salt, which is taken from the sea and is composed of grains. So let's just look at language, because I had an L there. Where is it? There it is. Isterokanit. Some commentaries maintain that this word comes from the name of the town Ostrakine, located on the border between Eretz Israel and Egypt along the coastline. Apparently, salt was harvested there. Okay, so we don't know exactly what kind of salt. The differences in salt, sodomite salt, so the salt from the Dead Sea, might be a different kind of consistency to it. And actually, I wonder if there are ponds. Well, I think there are ponds. There are potash factories, both in Israel and in Jordan, on both sides of the Dead Sea, because there's a lot of potash in the minerals in the water of the Dead Sea. So I would imagine that the so-called salt, when the water evaporates, is not the kind of salt that you can just then sprinkle on your food, because it has lots of other stuff in it. And so, yeah, when those of us who've been to the Dead Sea have seen kind of like the mounds of salt that are created when the water recedes and evaporates. So it is pretty thick, and that's why there's the tradition that Lot's wife, remember the story from the book of Genesis where Lot and his family were saved by the angels when the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. They were told, don't look back. but Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. So, of course, in driving along the Dead Sea, down by the bottom, the southern end of the Dead Sea on the Israeli side, where the biblical city of Sodom may have been, tour guides like to point out this is Lot's wife. And I'm sure each tour guide has a different pillar of salt that they refer to as the one that is Lot's wife. Okay, the Gemara adds, now that Rabbah said if a person makes 2 piles of salt at the opening to an alleyway and places a crossbeam on top of them so that the salt supports the crossbeam and the crossbeam supports the salt by weighing it down and compressing it, he can use this beam to render it permitted to carry in the alleyway on Shabbat. One can say that even istekaronit salt can be used as a barrier, and even so, Rav and Shmuel do not disagree. This ruling of Shmuel is referring to a case where there is a crossbeam to weigh the salt down, and that ruling of Rava is referring to a case where there's no crossbeam. Okay. The Mishnah teaches that one must distance a mill from a neighbor. So now we're back to the broader topic of the Mishnah itself about how owners of neighboring properties or bordering properties are supposed to move certain items a requisite distance from their neighbor's property. So the Mishnah teaches that one must distance a mill from a neighbor's wall by a distance of 3 handbreadths from the lower stone of the mill, which is 4 handbreadths from the upper stone of the mill. Okay, so you have some kind of property like that. The moving of the mill could damage the wall on your neighbor's property or something like that, unless it's moved at least 3 handbreadths away. The Gemara asks, what's the reason that one must distance a mill from the property of his neighbor? It's due to the vibrations it causes. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Baraita? And the measure for distancing a mill on a base is 3 handbreadths from the lower millstone, which is 4 handbreadths from the mouth where the wheat is fed in. But there, what vibrations are there? Rather, the reason for the distancing is due to the noise generated by the mill. So if you're already moving it, so a mill on a base. So this is an example of a flour mill found in Pompeii. So it's kind of like not a portable mill, but it's okay. So anyway, so already so they're questioning if already there is this distance built into the mill itself. What are we worried about the vibrations? Because it's already a few handbreadths apart. But it's the noise from the mill that you have to move it away from your neighbor's property so that they're not overly disturbed by the noise. The Mishnah teaches, and there must be a distance of 3 handbreadths from the protruding base of an oven until the wall, which is 4 handbreadths from the narrow upper rim of the oven. Abaye said, learn from the Mishnah that the base of an oven is a handbreadth wider than its rim. The practical difference of this observation is with respect to buying and selling. That is, a buyer should know that this is the proper ratio for the dimensions of an oven. Okay, and all right, and that's the end of the conversation about our Mishnah. Okay, on to another Mishnah now. Okay, so a person may not set up an oven inside a house unless there is a space 4 cubits high above it, that is between the top of the oven and the ceiling, to avoid burning the ceiling, which serves as the floor of the residence above. All right, so you're in an apartment, or the Mishnah talks a lot about lower and upper stories of a dwelling, and that 2 different people own the 2 different floors of the house. So if you have an oven in your house, it has to be the top of the oven has to be at least 4 cubits from the ceiling, because otherwise you have the potential of burning the ceiling, which damages your neighbor's property. If one was setting up an oven in the upper story, there must be a plaster floor beneath it, which serves as the ceiling of the lower story, at least 3 handbreadths thick, so that the ceiling below does not burn, right? Okay, so you get that. So you're also protecting your lower neighbor, your downstairs neighbor, by having at least a 3 handbreadth thick piece of plaster, a layer of plaster under the oven to protect the floor. And in the case of a stove, the plaster floor must be at least 1 handbreadth thick. Now, so the difference between an oven and a stove, let me just look. The Hebrew words are tanur for an oven, and a kira is a stove. So I'm not sure what it looked like. I wonder if there's no pictures here of a stove. So I don't know, but we'll see. Maybe the Gemara will talk about it. And if he causes damage in any case, he pays compensation for that which he damaged. Rabbi Shimon says they said all of these measurements to teach only that if he causes damage, he is exempt from paying, as he took all reasonable precautions. Right. So in other words, it seems like you have these precautions to take in terms of distance, but even if damage ensues, then you still are liable, according to the anonymous. But Rabbi Shimon says you're only responsible if you didn't pay attention to the measurements. But if you did, and it causes damage, then you're not liable because you had the minimum required being done. The Mishnah continues, a person may not open a bakery or a dye shop beneath the storeroom of another, and he may not establish a cattle barn there, as these produce heat, smoke, and odors, which rise and damage the items in the storeroom. The Mishnah comments, in truth, the halacha is that in the case of a storeroom of wine, the sages rendered it permitted to set up a bakery and a dye shop beneath, as the heat that rises does not damage the wine. But they did not render it permitted to establish a cattle barn because its odor damages the wine. So I'm not sure about the science there of that. I don't know if odor damages really today, but I'm not a winemaker. I would imagine that heat damages wine, but what do I know? The rabbis say the heat from a bakery, and that's an oven that is a commercial oven that reaches a higher temperature than an oven that somebody might have at home. Gemara. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Baraita that in the case of an oven, the plaster floor must be 4 handbreadths thick, and with regard to a stove, it must be 3? By contrast, the Mishnah says that the plaster floor beneath the oven and a stove must be 3 handbreadths and 1 handbreadth thick, respectively. Abaye said, when that Baraita is taught, it's with regard to ovens and stoves of bakers. Since they bake all day long, their implements get very hot. The oven discussed in our Mishnah is similar to a baker's stove, which is why, in both cases, a distance of 3 handbreadths is required. The Mishnah teaches that one may not open a bakery or a dye shop beneath the storeroom of another, and he may not establish a cattle barn there. A sage taught, if the cattle barn preceded the storeroom, it is permitted. That is, the barn owner is not required to move it. With regard to this point, Abaye raises a dilemma. If he cleaned and sprinkled the area, that is, he prepared it for use as a storeroom, but he has not yet filled it, what is the halacha? Is it considered a storeroom already, and therefore others may no longer put a cattle barn beneath it? Or perhaps the halacha is that as long as it's empty, he cannot prevent others from establishing a cattle barn. So in other words, what came first, the cattle barn or the storeroom? And what if neither cattle barn or storeroom is ready, but someone is in the process of preparing a room to be a storeroom? Is the neighbor still allowed to put in the dye shop or these other things? right? So at what point does something come before the other to prevent one from being built or established? Similarly, if he added windows for ventilation, which demonstrates his intention to use it as a storeroom, what is the halacha? Likewise, if he establishes an enclosed veranda beneath the storeroom, what is the halacha? If he built an upper room on top of his house for storage, what is the halacha? None of these questions are answered, and the Gemara declares that they shall stand unresolved. The Gemara cites a similar question. Rav Huna, son of Rav Yehoshua, raises a dilemma. If he placed dates and pomegranates there, what's the halacha? Is this considered the start of its use as a storeroom or not? No answer was found to this question either, and the Gemara declares the dilemma shall stand unresolved. It's fascinating to me that they couldn't figure out the answer to these questions. And they just decided to leave it unresolved. And the idea of leaving something unresolved, this word teku, taf, yud, kuf, vav, we've seen before over the years, the idea that Elijah, because the word teku is an abbreviation, so I'm hovering this around this word teku here. Tishbi, so the letter tuf stands for Tishbi. Yud stands for Yetaretz. Kuf is Kushiot, like the fear kashyas, right? For Passover, the 4 questions in Yiddish. Kushiot. And the vav for the letter, for the conjunction and, to start a word, uba'ayot. So Tishbi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu HaTishbi, right? So Elijah the Tishbite, he will solve all questions and problems. So the idea that Elijah will come to herald the Messianic era, and one of his jobs will be not only to escort the Messiah, the new king of Israel, to Jerusalem, but then he'll sit down and solve all these unresolved questions that are from the Gemara. Okay, and one little more paragraph here. The Mishnah teaches that in truth it is permitted in the case of wine, but not in the case of a cattle barn. The Gemara states that the sage taught they permitted it in the case of wine because the heat and smoke improve the wine, but they did not permit one to establish a cattle barn because a barn creates a bad odor. Rav Yosef said this wine of ours spoils quickly, and therefore even the smoke of a candle also damages it. Rav Sheshet said, and alfalfa is considered like a cattle barn in this regard because it rots over time and creates a foul odor. Okay, so folks, it's 10:10, and we come to another Mishnah here, which is a logical place to stop, and I'm going to stop here for today, and we'll pick up in this Mishnah. I assume that we all want to continue in Bava Batra in next year's Talmud class. So we'll pick up from this Mishnah on page 117 after Labor Day. So let me just wish you all a good rest of the day, a good weekend next week for Memorial Day, a good summer rest as well, and look forward to seeing you in Talmud class again in the fall. Take care,
Thank you.
everybody.
All right.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.